Hello, this is Cheryl Marlene. Welcome to Spiritual Deep Dive. In this episode, we hear from the Akashic Records during our weekly Akashic Record Insights workshop. The participants' question is this: what can the Akashic Records tell us about the ship, the Titanic? We begin with a few comments from the participant.
And I can give a little context as to why I'm asking this question, but I wonder what the records can tell us about the Titanic, the ship. And I ask this question because there's something bigger about that story, something bigger about the ship and what she represents than meets the eye. She was that ship was foretold. Her sinking was foretold in fiction, a fiction story that was written 14 years before she sank. Someone else wrote a fiction story about that sub implosion that happened a couple years back. There's just a lot of, I had a mystical experience recently where I was pulled down to the ocean floor and then I was pulled over to the Egyptian pyramids, and it seems like it's all somehow connected, but something keeps nudging at me. And I don't think it's on a personal level. Like, I'm not saying that I had a past life or something like that. It seems more current, whatever's going on. But there just seems like there's something bigger about that. Like, from the moment that ship was conceived to, well, she became something more after she sank. But I had a senior project in high school where I was prompted to do a story, a presentation, and a huge presentation on the Titanic. This was the same time that James Cameron got interested in the ship and was starting to pitch Paramount. So it's like there was a story needing to be told. And it was the same time that someone wrote about the sub implosion, that sub that visited the Titanic a couple of years back, wrote about it about the same time. So this is like, and when I feel into the timeline energy before the Titanic went down, it feels different than what happened afterwards, as if something, I don't know, significant occurred. And this may not make sense. It's just like I said, it wasn't what I was going to ask, but something is nudging me very strongly to ask about this, as if there's something in the records that can be revealed.
Okay. It makes sense to me. It's like we're going to go deep for this question, or the answer to this question. I know. I just had to say that.
I'm all for that.
Yeah. So, all right, let's see if I can explain this. Okay, we have this whole thing about the shift in human agreements, where about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, we shifted into this dominance of the body and the mind over the heart and the soul. And so that's the context with which they want to answer your question. So one of the things that comes out of that separation is essentially an inner sense within the human being that they are somehow separated and not connected. And so part of life is spent trying to establish connection. And there's different things that we feel drawn to do, pushed to do, in order to establish that sense of connection. And so that's also then why we tend to look at everything in a very linear way, past, present, and future. And we tend to look at things very sort of like black and white, or good and bad. And so humanity has all of its experiences, right? And we learn different things from different people, from ourselves, over time. And there are basically, it's that, like, especially a large group of people can get to a place where they're like, oh, we've got this. We know how this is going to work. And so if we build a big ship out of metal and put it in the ocean, it's still going to float because of this reason and that reason. And we figured it all out, right? That's the mind, asserting its dominance essentially over the experience of humanity. And it's not that that's not true, right? Because obviously we have figured that out, how you can have heavy metal float, right? Where from at least some perspective, you wouldn't think that that would be possible. But that's the human experience is in a sense, it's that when we're open to possibility, we learn that things we wouldn't think are possible, right? And you can almost go, they're saying you could go through like the whole development of humanity over the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. And you could say that there's a whole lot of things that we do now, that we understand now, that we would not have thought possible. I mean, even just this Zoom screen is not something, I mean, it was science fiction, 50 or 60 years ago, right? I mean, I started my whole business career spending a whole lot of time educating people on what the internet was, even though that kind of concept had been in literature for a very long time. So part of what you have there is that people become aware of possibility in different ways and at different, like within different timings or different timelines, so that there's almost always something that you didn't think would happen that got written about, let's say in a book, that whatever at some point in the future actually happens. And it's not so much that that writer wrote exactly about that future event, although that is a possibility. It's more that they're writing about what they've become aware is possible through, like, say, their intuitive sense of things and their intuitive understanding of how things are connected, right? So even though we deal with this mind and body over our heart and soul, the reality is that we are connected. It's just that we've been guided to believe that the mind is better than the body is better than the heart's better than the soul. That's what we've been guided to believe through all the different ways that kind of understanding can come out, like, not just religious, but culturally, socially, politically, economically. And so an event like the Titanic sinking is always a possibility, because that's what you get in the realm of infinite possibility. And sometimes we forget that just because the cool thing is possible, that the not so cool thing is also possible. And so you have points in history where things that you didn't think were possible happened, and then things that you didn't want to think would happen because this cool possible thing happens, right? Like it's the same kind of thing. It's the same kind of energy that would have been around the explosion of the Hindenburg, right? The big Zeppelin, right? And that was all presented as, like the next thing in human transportation. And it was cool. And there, all kinds of things. But when the Hindenburg, blew up and did its, fell or did whatever, it bashed the joyful anticipation that had developed because it became possible. So humanity has this problem that when the not so good thing happens, is to sort of like throw it all out, right? And part of what happened with the Titanic, I mean, yes, there were still big ocean liners going across the Atlantic and the Pacific, and there's still cruise ships and the whole thing, right? Like that's still there. When the Titanic went down, the big shift they think that happened was the sort of collective, oh gosh, this isn't probably a good idea anymore. And so then attention turned to a different possibility in a more direct way than saying that all we've got to do is build a whole bunch of Titanics and then we can all go around the world and everything's, happy and golden. And why did the agreement shift 2,000 to 3,000 years ago? They shifted to the mind and body over the heart and soul as a way to expand the capacity of the mind, which we've done. And now the mind has the capacity to reorient itself to the reality that human life is not solely dependent upon the mind. in that, like rational, intellectual, academic thinking mode, but that the mind is a powerful generator for the entirety of the human experience, which is integrated body, mind, heart, and soul. And that in a lot of ways we've been there, we've just ignored it or pretended that it wasn't there as a way to be able to get along in a world that tended towards that mind dominance position, and move into a place where it's like the unknown becomes at least less scary. And more importantly, doesn't become the excuse to demean something that is inherently at some point going to be fallible, right? Like a lot of that has to do with how in a certain sense, it's how you look at perfection and how you think, like if perfection is the goal, then the Titanic failed. And that is, they think that's the energy that reverberated and shifted the world. So whenever there's a big advance that's then followed by some sort of quote unquote failure within that advance, it shifts it again. Because the overarching intention of humanity, no matter what the agreements are, is to have, let's say, the deepest and broadest experience of life that's possible. And sometimes we balance that up against an environment that supports us in that. And sometimes we balance that up in against an environment that actually doesn't want us to succeed, which in a lot of ways is where we're all at right now, is that we've become very, very, very aware that there are aspects to our environment that actually isn't supportive because we don't want to give ourselves up. If we were willing to give ourselves up, see, and that's partly what happens when there's success and then there's a failure, is that everybody has to come into understanding for themselves about how they view, let's say, success and failure, and be willing to, in a certain sense, it's where it's about where you end up being on the blame scale. That's interesting. Like say with the Titanic, we could all stand around and just blame the people who made the boat or the ship. Sorry, it's a ship, not a boat. Right? Like that's, in other words, this horrible thing happens, and what happens for a lot of people is they have to decide who to blame for the failure. And I'm sure that there's all kinds of things that could be different in that whole story that might have kept that boat from sinking. But what they're going to say is that at some point or another, one of those big ocean-going liners was going to sink like that, because that's the possibility. That's one of the possibilities of doing something like that, which you can see as failure, or you can see as this is the reality of making this kind of effort. And that's not to say that, like people should die for it or anything like that, but it's just saying that the reality of it is that we live within infinite possibility. So that means any possibility is possible. But that's something that most of humanity doesn't want to, they don't want to deal with it that way because they want certainty, right? The fear that comes in with the mind and the body being dominant over the heart and the soul, and with the power over dynamics, is that we move into an environment where the way it works for most people is to be absolutely certain about how they stay safe and how the unknown is no longer the unknown. And so if you deal with the world that way, then you were limiting yourself from a broader perspective that has a much more, let's say, magnanimous, compassionate perspective when shit happens. And not that that's to let everybody off the hook, but it's dealing with it much more from the perspective of what is, what truly is, as opposed to what we want to pretend is. So something like the Titanic, another thing that happens around that is that a lot of people get embarrassed because they realized they had assumed that it was infallible. Then they learned that it's not infallible, and now they're embarrassed because they believed that it was infallible and they want to cover that up, right? So it forces people into a situation of having to try to decide how they're going to deal with what's true. And a whole lot of people don't like doing that. And so that's why you get blame. That's why you get more manipulation. That's why you get more fear, is because all of those things become ways in which, we're just going to pretend that we weren't that stupid, and we're going to go on. And so it won't be ships. We'll go to Zeppelins. Oh, that didn't work. Well, let's try airplanes. That's working. But yeah, plenty of airplanes that haven't stayed in the air properly for a variety of different reasons, right? And so underwater motion is the effort to try to understand something that hasn't been understood in a lot of depth, in a lot of depth. And so you end up with people who want to take that, that want to take the risk of that. I mean, is there more around any of those situations? Yeah, probably. But what they're dealing with, what they're trying to talk about here for all of us right now, is the connection over time to those events. That answer your question?
Honestly, answers quite a few questions, because it also come in while you were talking about that, and I comment on it. What you said about possibility was true, because when the gentleman wrote the story about a fictional ocean liner that sank 14 years, he described the events of the Titanic almost perfectly, but he called the ship the Titan. And when he tried to get it published, they denied it. They said, no one's going to believe this. This couldn't possibly happen. Just so when you were talking about that, it was like, wow, that's that there. But when the ship went down, it was like she was a ship of dreams, a ship of possibilities, and she still actually is, because it's pushed people to create submarines that could reach those depths. It's pushed people to talk about
Yes.
what, like, if they raised her. So it opened up doors to other possibilities. She's never stopped being
Right.
possibilities. I mean, although it went down, and like you said, people, they get afraid. They retrofitted her two sister ships to try to prevent a similar disaster, and yet one of them still sank. The Britannic still went down, even with a retrofitting. So, and then there was the other piece you mentioned too. Like when that sub went down there, it was, again, it went similar to the Titanic, and imploded. People lost their life, and now everybody's like backing off, saying, "Oh, maybe this isn't a good idea. We should stop all future visits to the ship and stuff." The same kind of thing, but because they took that risk. They took that risk of going down there with something new, and some, just like the ship itself. So you can see the connection there between the two of them.
Yeah.
But it's like all that the ship is inspired, nothing but possibility. Even to this day, it still ripples across time, because still those visions are in there. And you're right, there are people that don't want to look at it. People like, oh, just leave it alone, it's a gravesite. But that's just an excuse not to look at it. People won't watch the movie because they're like, oh, that really happened. I don't want to see that. It's
Right.
too much to reality. I can watch a horror movie about a bunch of people getting killed, but I can't watch something that really happened.
Right.
There's a lot there to unpack. It's pretty. You were right. It was pretty deep.
Yeah. Well, and the part of it is like, with something like the Titanic, there's not just one story about what happened, because everybody on that ship had a different experience. And so when you go trying to look for the truth of something like that, it's very, very, very difficult. Like, say, to do that, like within the records, like this, what they're saying to me, is very, very difficult, because everybody's got a different perspective. So if you go searching for what is the truth of the Titanic sinking, it's going to be a difficult thing to get to, because of all of those different perspectives, right? So if you're doing like remote viewing or something like that, it's just a complicated thing. The other part of it is that when something like that happens, it's natural for people to want to explain why it happened so it won't happen again. Mm-hmm. Right? And we've been doing that one for a very, 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 very long time. And it's how fear intersects with truth in hindsight that creates conspiracy theories, right? Right. So it's how fear intersects with truth, and then through hindsight creates conspiracy theories, right? So if you want, so like, for example, why, if you want to answer the question, why did the Titanic sink? And you want to do that, like, say, through the Akashic Records, for example, the problem that you're going to have is how to deal with the truth of all of those different stories as a way to answer the question with some sense of validity or reliability. Okay. And that in the event, and even prior to the event and after the event, you got all kinds of fear threads, let's say, flows of fear within all of that is going to intersect with all the stories, right? So even if you just focus on one person on the Titanic and what their experience is, there's going to be fear associated with that story that has the potential of impacting how you would answer the question, how did the Titanic sink? And so that energy comes together and is part of what drives conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories are based usually on at least a thread of truth wrapped up with a whole bunch of fear. Oh my God, what if, so someone could be standing on the Titanic thinking, oh my God, right, whoever just took us out. And it could just be that's the way they're dealing with the event and the fear, and it's absolute, but that's their truth, even though even though they think the ship just got hit by a torpedo or something like that, and that because that's how they're going to explain how is this ship sinking, it does not necessarily mean there was a torpedo, right? Mm-hmm. So that something like the Titanic ends up with enough energy coming out of the event that persists, that people hook onto to try to explain why it went down. So when you're looking at it, it's a complicated thing to weave yourself through all of that. And so any event ends up having that kind of issue around it, right? I mean, it's like, say, with the insurrection of January 6th in the United States. Oh my God, right? Like, how many people were a part of all of that in all the different ways that, including everybody that's watching a live feed of the event. That's a lot of people that have experiences of what happened. So being able to answer that question becomes a difficult thing to do because of the energy that is created because of the event.
That's my thing was like, it's more the sinking is just one part of the story. It's the overall context that I was looking at, because the story's being written. It's not over. Just because she's down on the ocean floor, it's still being written. I mean, right. It's sub, still state that. So that's, it's the bigger context of the entire lifespan of the ship, not just the sinking itself. But yes, that makes sense about conspiracy theories and stuff. So yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Say real quickly too, a few months ago for validation, when I asked you about the moon, and you said, well, the Earth was shifting away from the moon, not the moon moving away from to make room for another planetary body, and now we've got that second moon. So I just wanted to say that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I noticed that one. Cool. Brian, thank you for your questions, your comments. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. This has been an episode of Spiritual Deep Dive. For more, visit spiritualdeepdive.com or my website, cherylmarlene.com. To join the next weekly Akashic Record Insights workshop, go to akashicrecordinsights.com.